The "We live in a society" meme originally comes from The Dark Knight, wherein the Joker has some speech where he says, "Oh, if a bunch of soldiers or a gangbanger die, nobody cares, but if a kid gets killed, everybody freaks out," etc. And it rapidly evolved into a bunch of different sub memes. One including gamers rise up, another talking about the friend zone, stuff about weed. Another kind of branch of the meme was you'd have two things compared. Like one is Mickey Mouse and then a normal rat, and there'd be a whole bunch of likes and hearts for Mickey Mouse and nothing for the normal rat. So, generally speaking, it either has something to the effect of a picture of the Joker and it says "We live in a society" and then there's subtext under it, or it's like a comparison of two things. So that's basically the meme, but we're not really here to talk about the image itself. We're here to kind of talk about, as I did with the NPC thing, what is kind of the psycho-sociological thing behind it? What does it mean in kind of a broader sense? Now, one of the things when you're dealing with memes is it's hard to tell where irony starts and where sincerity begins. It's hard to tell when, like, how much of it is real, how much of it is ironic, how much of it is unironic. Because I've seen the "We live in a society" used ironically, I've seen it used unironically, I've used it semi-ironically, etc. So let's just kind of take a step back. What is the expression "we live in a society"? Generally speaking, "we live in a society" is used to point to something very often mundane or mainstream for rhetorical purposes. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, for instance, if I was doing this, I might say, "We live in a society where the unborn have no rights, but cockroaches do." Or, "Cockroaches have more rights than the unborn." We live in a society where open guns are legal, but gravity knives aren't. Or we live in a society where racism's still a thing. We live in a society where some people are rich and others are poor. It's trying to draw attention to a contrast or something kind of widely seen within a particular society for rhetorical purposes, normally to kind of shock the person, or, like I said, to point out a hypocrisy or kind of a contradiction or a paradox within a particular society. And the issue is, this kind of ties a bit into the NPC meme, is it's often used inappropriately by kind of NPCs. And I mean, on a very, very basic level, by people who are trying to sound smart. And that's kind of why the Joker from The Dark Knight is used, because he's the epitome of, like, a armchair nihilist or a straw man nihilist. He makes all these big, like, semi-philosophical speeches that don't necessarily make any sense, but it's all about, like, a criticism of society. And that's something that people will often just state when they have no idea really what they're talking about. There's no real context. It's something that sounds profound. It's like, "We live in a society where people are judged by their appearance and not their character. We live in a society where people still lie on the streets," etc. And it's saying, like, this is something very profound, that I'm calling attention to this thing that no one's ever thought about before or noticed. It's a very common, I guess you could say, NPC thing. It's very common, particularly among the left, and that's because the left is the default at the moment. So most kind of people who can't think for themselves tend to be integrated with that, because they just kind of do whatever the pop culture thing is at the moment. So when they're trying to sound intelligent, they'll say, like, "We live in a society," like I said, "where racism still exists. We live in a society where 40% of black males will be in jail at some point." And they'll think that they're clever and they're profound for saying this, but they don't really get what the rhetorical point is. And one of kind of the reasons for parodying this is oftentimes people will say, "We live in a society," and then insert something that's not absurd at all, or isn't a contradiction, or it's just something that always is the case and always will be the case. Like, one is, "We live in a society where children are indoctrinated in schools." when that's pretty much always been the case. All societies, even if they don't have public schools per se, have had some form of education at home or otherwise that indoctrinates, quote unquote, children into whatever the social and religious norms of the age are. There's nothing unusual about that. We live in a society where people are unequal. That's something that's existed in every society. That's not something profound, etc. It's the current year is another one like that. It's we live in the current year. Why isn't this thing this thing? And it's something that sounds good. It makes you sound profound, but it's really not saying anything. And you could very easily give it some context. Like you could say it's 2016. Why are people still starving? And you could kind of modify that and come up with something like it's 20 in this current day and age with industrial scale agriculture, we're producing so much food, we're throwing a lot of it out. Hunger just shouldn't be a thing with the amount of production we have and how cheap food is. Like, because that makes sense, because that's saying, well, there's the current year, or we live in a society, but I'm making like an actual criticism as opposed to just stating the obvious and thinking it makes you deep. So just to re-summarize very briefly, we live in a society is a meme that mocks a very common rhetorical statement that's primarily used by people who have no idea what they're talking about to try to sound smarter than they are. And in some cases, funnily enough, kind of normies or NPCs or whatever you want to call them have just started unironically using it to be like, we live in a society where people judge women by their looks, or we live in a society where people like women who aren't obese, and stuff like that. And they've started to unironically use it, which is kind of double the irony because it was originally created to mock exactly those sorts of people, but then they jumped on. See what I mean? Like, this whole thing can get very confusing and multi-leveled. But that's the purpose. There are appropriate ways to use it if you're making an actual point, if you're pointing to an actual, like, real contradiction. But by and large, it's mainly used by fake intellectual hacks. Anyways, more meme explains things to come, and I'll talk to you guys later.